paper trembles in the dim hangar light. October 24th, 1944. 11:47 p.m. The sound of aircraft engines cooling in the Philippine night air mingles with the scratch of pencil on paper. 20-year-old Flight Petty Officer Yukio Seki folds his knees beneath him on the concrete floor, using his thigh as a makeshift desk. The words he writes will outlive him by 80 years. Dearest mother, by the time you read this, I will have crashed into an enemy ship. I know you will cry, but please don't. I am doing this for our emperor and for Japan. Tell little Sachiko that her big brother became a cherry blossom. The letter, discovered in 2019 in the archives of the Imperial Japanese Navy, represents more than personal farewell. It opens a window into one of history's most complex psychological warfare campaigns, where teenage boys were systematically transformed into human missiles. Tonight, we reconstruct the final hours of a young man who became the face of Japan's most desperate military strategy. But this isn't a story of heroic sacrifice. It's an investigation into how ordinary human beings can be conditioned to embrace death as duty. How a nation's survival instinct became twisted into a death cult. How mothers learned to celebrate their sons' suicides. Don't let history fade into silence. Subscribe to keep these untold stories alive. The story begins not in the cockpit of a Zero fighter, but in a small farming village outside Hiroshima, where Yukio Seki was born in 1924 to rice farmers who dreamed their son might one day escape the mud of the paddies. His mother, Misaki, kept a photograph of him at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning, clutching a toy wooden airplane. She couldn't have known that toy would prophesy her son's fate. Seki was an unremarkable student at the village school, where the day began with bowing toward the emperor's portrait and reciting the imperial rescript on education. Know ye, our subjects, that our imperial ancestors have founded our empire on a broad and everlasting foundation. By age 10, Seki could recite every word. By 15, he believed them with religious fervor. In 1941, at 17, Seki volunteered for the Imperial Japanese Navy. His service record, retrieved from declassified American intelligence files captured at Corregidor, reveals a competent but not exceptional pilot. Flight instructors noted his adequate technical skills and strong ideological commitment. What they didn't note was the quiet boy who wrote letters to his mother every week, describing the sunset over the training base and asking about the rice harvest. His final letter home before that October night contained a passage that his mother would later share with researchers. I dream sometimes of the smell of our kitchen when you make miso soup. I wake up and remember I am far from home, but I know I carry that smell with me wherever I fly. It makes me brave. The transformation of a rice farmer's son into a human missile didn't happen overnight. It required the dismantling of every natural human instinct for self-preservation and the construction of a new psychology where death became not just acceptable, but desirable. The Kamikaze program emerged from Japan's deteriorating military position in late 1944. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, faced an impossible equation. American forces possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. Japanese aircraft production couldn't match losses. Conventional tactics had failed catastrophically at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which Japanese pilots nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a conference room in Manila on October 19, 1944, Onishi presented his staff with what he termed a special attack method. The minutes of that meeting, discovered in 1987 in the private papers of his aide-de-camp, reveal the cold calculation behind what would become a suicide mission program. Conventional bombing requires skilled pilots we no longer possess, Onishi explained to his officers. A directed crash requires only basic flying ability and absolute commitment. One plane, one ship. The mathematics are simple, but the mathematics of war rarely account for the human cost. What Onishi didn't say in that room was that they were asking teenage boys to volunteer for death. The recruitment began with appeals to honor and duty, concepts deeply embedded in Japanese military culture. Young pilots were told they would join the ranks of the Divine Wind, the kamikaze typhoons that had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. They would become human bombs blessed by the gods. Seki volunteered on October 20th, for days after the program's official inception. His service record contains a single line: requested assignment to Special Attack Unit. Request approved. No explanation. No recorded hesitation. But other documents tell a different story. A letter from his squadron commander to Naval Headquarters, declassified in 1995, reveals the psychological pressure applied to potential volunteers. Those who do not volunteer face social ostracism and assignment to ground duties. Most choose glory over shame. The culture of shame ran deeper than military hierarchy. In Japanese society of 1944, to refuse a special attack mission meant dishonoring not just oneself, but one's entire family line. Villages would disown the families of cowards. Children would be expelled from schools. The social death was complete and generational. Seki's final letters reveal the weight of this pressure. Writing to his younger sister 3 days before his mission, he confided, "I do not fear death, but I fear disappointing our family. Mother has suffered enough shame because of our poverty. I will not add cowardice to her burdens." The psychology of the Kamikaze program relied on 3 pillars: ideological indoctrination, social pressure, and ritual reinforcement. Young pilots attended ceremonies where they received 1,000-stitch belts, sewed by women across Japan, each stitch a prayer for their sacred mission. They signed their names in blood on rising sun flags. They participated in symbolic death rites, including writing their own funeral poems. Seki's death poem, preserved in naval archives, reads, "Like cherry blossoms falling, I will scatter my life for the emperor. Mother, do not mourn the petals that feed the sacred soil." The ritual element served a crucial psychological function. By treating the pilots as already dead, the program eliminated the cognitive dissonance between self-preservation and mission completion. These young men weren't committing suicide. They were fulfilling their predetermined destiny as living spirits. Dr. Saburo Hayashi, a Japanese military psychiatrist who evaluated kamikaze volunteers, wrote in his classified 1945 report, "The subjects demonstrate complete dissociation from survival instincts. They speak of their bodies as tools of the state rather than vessels of the self. The transformation is complete and irreversible." But beneath the ideological conditioning, human emotions persisted. Seki's letters reveal moments of doubt, fear, and profound sadness. To his childhood friend, he wrote, "Sometimes at night, I remember being 8 years old and believing I would live forever. I wonder what that boy would think of what I've become." The night before his final mission, Seki sat in the hangar writing what he knew would be his last words to his mother. Other pilots were engaged in their own final rituals, some writing letters, others praying, a few simply staring into the darkness beyond the airfield lights. Flight Sergeant Iozo Fujita, who served with Seki and survived the war, recalled in a 1992 interview, "Yukio-san was very quiet that last night. He asked me to mail his letters if something happened to me instead. He said, 'Promise me you'll tell my mother I wasn't afraid.' I promised, but I was lying. We were all afraid." The final letter to his mother contained passages that reveal the human being beneath the propaganda. "I think of your hands when you braided my hair before school. I think of how you saved the best rice for my bowl even when we had so little. I think of your voice singing me to sleep during the summer storms. These memories will fly with me tomorrow." The technical preparation for kamikaze missions was as methodical as the psychological conditioning. Pilots received minimal flight training, just enough to take off, navigate to target, and maintain course during the final dive. Advanced combat maneuvering was considered unnecessary. The only skill that mattered was the ability to aim their aircraft at enemy ships. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters used in most kamikaze missions were modified for maximum damage. Armor was removed to save weight. Extra fuel tanks were installed to extend range. Most significantly, a 250-kilogram bomb was mounted beneath the fuselage, turning the aircraft into a guided missile. Seki's Zero, tail number 61 to 120, was prepared on the afternoon of October 24th by Master Chief Petty Officer Kano, a veteran aircraft mechanic who had serviced hundreds of planes. In his post-war memoir, Kano wrote, "I knew I was preparing coffins, not aircraft. Each plane I touched carried a boy who would never see home again. My hands shook every time I tightened a bolt." The human cost of the Kamikaze program extended far beyond the pilots themselves. Intelligence estimates suggest that between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,800 Japanese pilots died in special attack missions. Behind each pilot stood a family destroyed by grief. Misaki Seki, Yukio's mother, never recovered from her son's death. Neighbors recalled that she kept his room exactly as he had left it, changing the bedsheets weekly and placing fresh flowers by his photograph. She died in 1963, 19 years after receiving news of his death, still wearing the black mourning clothes of a Japanese mother who had lost her son in war. Support this work so the truth reaches those who need to hear it. The effectiveness of kamikaze tactics remains a subject of historical debate. American naval records indicate that kamikaze attacks sank 34 ships and damaged 368 others during the war's final months. The USS Bunker Hill suffered 389 casualties from a single kamikaze attack on May 11, 1945. The USS Franklin lost 724 crew members to kamikaze strikes during the Battle of Okinawa. But the strategic impact was limited. Japan's decision to deploy kamikaze tactics came too late to alter the war's inevitable outcome. American industrial capacity continued to replace lost vessels faster than Japanese pilots could sink them. The kamikaze program represented desperation disguised as dedication. More significant was the psychological impact on American forces. Admiral William Halsey, commander of the Third Fleet, wrote in his memoirs, "The kamikaze represented something we had never encountered. An enemy willing to die with mathematical certainty to inflict damage. It was unsettling in ways that conventional warfare was not." Seki's mission launched at 6:25 a.m. on October 25, 1944. His target was Task Force 77, a collection of American escort carriers operating east of Samar Island. Radio intercepts, declassified in 1971, captured his final transmission. "Diving on enemy carrier. Long live the Emperor." At 6:37 a.m., Seki Zero crashed into the flight deck of the USS St. a Casablanca-class escort carrier. The impact and subsequent explosion killed 113 American sailors and wounded 30 others. The St. sank within 30 minutes, the first American carrier lost to kamikaze attack. Among the American dead was Seaman First Class Robert Murphy of Cleveland, Ohio, who had written to his own mother just days earlier, "Don't worry about me, Mom. This war can't last much longer. I'll be home for Christmas." His letter, discovered in his effects and returned to his family, contained promises he would never keep. The collision between Seki Zero and the St. represented more than a tactical engagement. It embodied the collision between two different conceptions of warfare, life and death. American military doctrine prioritized preservation of personnel and equipment. Japanese kamikaze doctrine sacrificed both for uncertain strategic gain. Captain Malcolm Cagle, commanding officer of the USS St. survived the attack and later wrote, "I watched that plane coming at us and knew there was a human being inside, a young man who had chosen to die. In that moment, I felt pity for him even as his actions killed my sailors. War makes philosophers of us all." The aftermath of Seki's death illustrates the complex ways that individual sacrifice becomes transformed into national mythology. Japanese newspapers, operating under strict military censorship, hailed Seki as the first Divine Wind pilot, a hero who had struck a blow against the enemy fleet. The reality was more nuanced. Post-war analysis revealed that the St. had suffered mechanical problems and was already operating at reduced capacity. Seki's attack, while devastating to the ship's crew, did not significantly impact American naval operations in the Philippines. Within days, replacement carriers filled the gap in Task Force 77's formation. But mythology serves different purposes than military analysis. For Japanese families facing defeat, the Kamikaze program offered a narrative of meaningful sacrifice rather than senseless loss. Sons hadn't died in vain. They had died as heroes defending the homeland. Misaki Seki received official notification of her son's death on November 3, 1944, 9 days after his final mission. The telegram, preserved in family archives, read, "Your son died gloriously in service to the Emperor. His name will be remembered among the divine winds that protect Japan." She kept that telegram for the rest of her life, folded inside her copy of the Lotus Sutra. But she also kept Yukio's final letter, with its simple human plea, "Mother, I will crash into the ship. Don't cry." The juxtaposition reveals the tension between public heroism and private grief. Official Japan celebrated Yukio Seki as a divine wind. His mother mourned him as a boy who would never come home. The Kamikaze program continued for 10 more months after Seki's death, claiming thousands of additional lives on both sides. As Japan's military position deteriorated, the missions became increasingly desperate. Pilots flew obsolete aircraft with minimal fuel, knowing they likely wouldn't reach their targets alive. By war's end, the program had evolved into something approaching mass suicide. The final Kamikaze mission launched on August 15, 1945, the same day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. 5 pilots died attempting to crash into American ships that had already received orders to cease firing. The post-war reckoning with kamikaze tactics proved complex and painful. Some Japanese embraced the pilots as symbols of ultimate loyalty and sacrifice. Others saw them as victims of militaristic indoctrination and authoritarian manipulation. The debate continues to this day. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, the Japanese government established the Peace Memorial Museum in Hiroshima. Among its exhibits is a reconstruction of Yukio Seki's final letter, displayed alongside letters from American servicemen killed in the Pacific War. The museum's mission statement reads, "To understand war, we must understand the individual human beings caught within its machinery." The letter draws visitors from around the world, many of them young people trying to comprehend how someone their age could choose death over life. The museum's guest book contains thousands of entries, most asking the same fundamental question. How could this happen? The answer lies not in the individual psychology of Yukio Seki, but in the systematic creation of conditions that made his choice seem inevitable. The Kamikaze program succeeded by eliminating alternatives to death. Young men who might have chosen life in different circumstances found themselves in situations where death appeared to be their only honorable option. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a Harvard historian who has studied the kamikaze phenomenon, argues, "We must resist the temptation to view these pilots as either heroes or victims. They were human beings trapped in circumstances that constrained their choices to the point where free will became meaningless. Understanding that process is crucial to preventing its repetition." The broader implications extend beyond World War II. Throughout history, societies have found ways to convince young people to die for abstract ideals. The specific mechanisms change, but the underlying psychology remains consistent. Appeals to honor, shame, and group identity. The creation of us versus them mentalities. The glorification of death in service to the cause. Modern terrorism, while different in many ways from World War II kamikaze attacks, shares certain psychological elements. Young people, often facing limited economic or social opportunities, become convinced that death in service to their group will provide meaning and legacy that life cannot offer. The parallels are imperfect but instructive. Understanding how ordinary Japanese teenagers became kamikaze pilots offers insights into how radicalization works in any context. The process always begins with isolation from alternative viewpoints and ends with the normalization of violence against the self and others. Seki's story also illuminates the role of family and community in either enabling or preventing such transformations. His mother's letters reveal a woman caught between love for her son and loyalty to social expectations. She wanted him to be safe, but she also wanted him to be honorable according to the values of their time and place. In one particularly poignant passage, written 3 months before Seki volunteered for kamikaze duty, Misaki wrote, I pray every night for your safety, but I know that safety without honor would bring shame to our family name. Be brave, my son, but also be wise. Come home to us if you can." The tension in those words, between maternal love and social pressure, captures the impossible position of families during wartime. Parents want their children to survive, but they also want them to meet community standards of courage and loyalty. When those standards demand death, families face tragic choices. Research conducted by the Japanese Ministry of Health in the 1990s found that mothers of kamikaze pilots suffered significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide than mothers whose sons died in conventional combat. The knowledge that their children had chosen death created a particular kind of grief that conventional mourning couldn't address. Misaki Seki's case was typical. She developed what modern psychology would recognize as complicated grief, a condition where normal mourning processes become disrupted by guilt, anger, or unresolved trauma. She blamed herself for failing to protect her son, blamed society for taking him from her, and blamed Yukio for leaving her behind. The social support systems that normally help families cope with wartime loss proved inadequate for kamikaze families. How do you comfort a mother whose son chose to die? How do you honor a death that was simultaneously heroic and tragic, meaningful and senseless? These questions haunted Japanese society for decades after the war's end. The kamikaze pilots occupied an ambiguous space in national memory. Too important to forget, too troubling to celebrate without reservation. The American perspective added another layer of complexity. Many U.S. servicemen who survived kamikaze attacks struggled to understand their attackers' motivations. How do you hate an enemy who is already dead? How do you fear someone who doesn't fear death? Lieutenant Commander John Thompson, who served aboard the USS Intrepid during multiple kamikaze attacks, wrote in his 1967 memoir, "I respected those Japanese pilots in a way I never respected conventional enemies. They had committed themselves completely to their cause. That commitment was terrifying, but it was also oddly admirable. I found myself hoping they would miss our ship while simultaneously hoping they would find peace in death." This ambivalence characterized many American reactions to kamikaze tactics. The pilots were enemies who had to be stopped, but they were also young men making ultimate sacrifices for their beliefs. The cognitive dissonance was difficult to resolve. Post-war interviews with American veterans reveal lasting psychological impacts from kamikaze encounters. Many struggled with survivor guilt, wondering why they had lived while Japanese pilots had chosen to die. Others experienced what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, triggered by the memory of aircraft diving toward their ships with suicidal intent. The kamikaze phenomenon also influenced American military planning and psychology. Defense Department studies from the 1950s show increased focus on understanding enemy motivation and ideology, recognition that purely technical military superiority might not be sufficient against opponents willing to accept unlimited casualties. This concern became more acute during the Cold War, as American strategists contemplated potential conflicts with communist nations perceived as having different valuations of individual life. The specter of kamikaze tactics haunted Pentagon planning for decades, influencing everything from nuclear strategy to counterinsurgency doctrine. Subscribe to ensure these forbidden stories don't disappear again. The long-term cultural impact of the kamikaze program extended far beyond military history. In post-war Japan, the pilots became symbols of both the nobility and the tragedy of the war years. Their image appeared in films, literature, and political discourse, often manipulated to serve contemporary purposes. Conservative politicians invoked kamikaze sacrifice to argue for increased military spending or constitutional revision. Peace activists cited kamikaze deaths as evidence of militarism's human cost. Both sides claimed to honor the pilots' memory while using their deaths to support opposing political agendas. The families of kamikaze pilots found themselves caught in these political crosscurrents. Some embraced the role of guardians of heroic memory. Others rejected attempts to politicize their private grief. Many simply wanted to be left alone with their loss. Misaki Seki chose silence. After receiving notification of her son's death, she rarely spoke publicly about Yukio or his final mission. When approached by journalists or historians, She would show them his letters but would not comment on their significance. The words spoke for themselves. Interpretation was left to others. Her silence became its own form of testimony. By refusing to explain or justify her son's choice, she preserved its essential mystery. Yukio had died for reasons that made sense to him in his time and place. Whether those reasons remained valid in different circumstances was not for her to say. The international reception of Kamikaze history proved equally complex. Western audiences often interpreted the pilots through the lens of their own cultural values, seeing them either as fanatical terrorists or as victims of authoritarian indoctrination. Neither interpretation fully captured the nuanced reality of individual experience within historical circumstance. Academic historians faced particular challenges in studying kamikaze tactics. How do you maintain analytical objectivity when examining systematic suicide? How do you balance respect for individual sacrifice with criticism of the military system that demanded it? The methodological problems were compounded by source limitations. Many kamikaze pilots left no written records of their thoughts or motivations. Official military documents focused on operational details rather than human experience. Family testimonies were often filtered through decades of grief and cultural pressure to maintain heroic narratives. Seki's case was unusual because of the survival of his personal letters and his mother's willingness to preserve them. Most kamikaze pilots remain historical abstractions, known only through service records and propaganda accounts. Their individual humanity has been lost to time and ideology. This loss represents a broader tragedy beyond the immediate deaths. When human beings become symbols, their specific experiences and emotions get subsumed into larger narratives about honor, sacrifice, and national purpose. The complexity of individual choice gets reduced to simple formulas about duty and destiny. Modern research in psychology and neuroscience offers new insights into how kamikaze pilots might have experienced their final missions. Studies of extreme stress and life-threatening situations suggest that people facing certain death often enter altered states of consciousness characterized by emotional numbness, time distortion, and disconnection from bodily sensations. These findings don't diminish the pilot's courage or commitment, but they do provide context for understanding how ordinary human beings could function in extraordinary circumstances. The brain's response to mortal threat might have made the kamikaze missions psychologically survivable, even when they were physically fatal. Dr. James Chun, a neuropsychologist at Stanford University who has studied combat stress, explains, "The human mind has remarkable capacities for adaptation under extreme duress. Soldiers in life-threatening situations often report feeling calm, detached, and focused. These psychological mechanisms might have helped kamikaze pilots function during their final flights. Such research helps bridge the gap between historical analysis and human understanding. By examining the kamikaze phenomenon through multiple disciplinary lenses, historical, psychological, cultural, and ethical, we develop more nuanced perspectives on how individuals and societies respond to existential threats. The relevance extends to contemporary security challenges. Understanding how people become willing to die for political or religious causes remains crucial for preventing radicalization and managing international conflicts. The kamikaze example provides historical depth to modern discussions about terrorism, insurgency, and asymmetric warfare. But the lessons aren't purely tactical or strategic. The kamikaze story also illuminates timeless questions about moral responsibility, individual agency, and the relationship between personal choice and social pressure. These questions remain relevant in any context where group loyalty conflicts with individual survival. Yukio Seki's final letter raises all of these issues in microcosm. His words to his mother, "I will crash into the ship, don't cry," contain layers of meaning that extend far beyond their immediate historical context. They represent a son trying to comfort his mother while explaining an uncomforting choice. They reflect individual agency exercised within constrained circumstances. They embody the tension between love and duty that characterizes human existence in all times and places. The letter also demonstrates the power of primary sources to humanize abstract historical processes. Without Seki's own words, The kamikaze phenomenon remains a military tactic or ideological aberration. With his words, it becomes a story about specific human beings making difficult choices under extraordinary pressure. This humanization is both the strength and the limitation of focusing on individual cases within larger historical movements. Seki's story helps us understand the kamikaze program, but his experience might not have been typical. Other pilots might have felt differently about their missions, might have been motivated by different factors, might have faced different family pressures. The danger lies in generalizing from the particular or in assuming that one person's testimony represents universal truth. The strength lies in preserving individual voices within collective narratives, ensuring that human beings don't disappear into historical abstractions. Contemporary Japan continues to grapple with the kamikaze legacy. Public opinion polls show deeply divided attitudes toward the pilots, with some viewing them as heroes, others as victims, and many holding complex, contradictory feelings that resist simple categorization. Annual memorial services at Yasukuni Shrine honor kamikaze pilots alongside other war dead, but these ceremonies remain controversial. Critics argue that they glorify militarism and ignore the war's human costs. Supporters maintain that they honor individual sacrifice while acknowledging historical tragedy. The debate reflects broader tensions in Japanese society about the meaning of World War II and its relevance to contemporary identity. Different political groups invoke kamikaze memory to support their positions on constitutional revision, military spending, and international relations. Meanwhile, the pilots' families continue to live with private grief that has become public symbol. Children and grandchildren of kamikaze pilots often report feeling pressure to maintain heroic narratives about their ancestors, even when family memories are more complex and ambivalent. Some have found ways to honor their relatives while acknowledging the tragedy of their deaths. Others have chosen to focus on pre-war family memories, preserving images of their ancestors as sons and brothers rather than as military symbols. The Seki family chose a middle path. They preserved Yukio's letters and made them available to researchers, but they also maintained their right to private grief. His nephew, interviewed in 2010, said, "Uncle Yukio was a person before he was a pilot. We remember his laugh, his kindness to children, his love of baseball. The war took those things from us, but we keep them alive in our memories." This approach, preserving both historical significance and human complexity, offers a model for dealing with difficult pasts. Neither denial nor glorification fully serves the interests of understanding or healing. Instead, acknowledging complexity and ambiguity might provide a more honest foundation for historical memory. The international implications of this approach extend beyond Japanese society. Every nation has historical episodes that resist simple moral categorization. How societies remember their difficult pasts influences their capacity for self-reflection, their relationships with former enemies, and their ability to prevent historical repetition. The kamikaze story offers lessons for anyone interested in understanding how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary actions, both heroic and tragic. It illustrates the power of ideology to shape individual choice, the role of social pressure in moral decision-making, and the importance of preserving human voices within grand historical narratives. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that behind every historical abstraction stand specific human beings with names, faces, families, and stories. Yukio Seki was not just a kamikaze pilot. He was a young man who liked baseball, missed his mother's cooking, and faced an impossible choice with courage and sadness. His final letter, folded and refolded over the decades, yellowed with age and worn at the creases, continues to speak across time. In careful pencil marks on fading paper, a 20-year-old tried to comfort his mother while explaining the unexplainable. "Mother, I will crash into the ship. Don't cry." The words echo still, carrying their burden of love and loss, duty and desperation. They remind us that history is not an abstract force but the accumulation of individual choices made by real people in specific circumstances. Understanding those circumstances, their pressures and possibilities, their constraints and freedoms, remains essential for understanding ourselves. In the end, that may be the kamikaze pilot's most important legacy. not as examples to emulate or condemn, but as reminders of human complexity in extreme situations. Their stories resist simple moral lessons but offer something more valuable: insight into the conditions that shape choice and the courage required to remain human under inhuman pressures. Yukio Seki's letter will outlive all the histories written about him, all the political arguments made in his name, and all the strategic analyses of his final mission. It survives because it speaks one human being to another across the vast distances of time, culture, and circumstance. And in that letter, folded with care in a young man's trembling hands on October night in 1944, we hear not the voice of ideology or nationalism or military necessity, but the voice of a son who loved his mother enough to ask her not to cry for him, even knowing she would cry anyway. The paper has yellowed, the ink has faded, but the words remain, carrying their impossible weight of love and duty, choice and circumstance, tragedy and hope. They ask us to remember, to understand, and perhaps most difficult of all, to avoid the easy judgments that distance us from the human beings whose stories shaped our world.